Today's webinar is being presented by Claire Schutte, our staff psychologist at the Johnson Center for Child Health and Development. She graduated with honors from the University of Florida with a BS in psychology and a minor in general education. She completed graduate training at Florida Institute of Technology, completing a doctoral degree in clinical psychology and a master's degree in applied behavioral analysis. Dr. Schutte has treated a diverse population of children, adolescents, and adults in a variety of clinical settings, including community clinics, college counseling centers, psychiatric hospitals, private practice, and private treatment programs. She has extensive experience in the area of child and adult psychological evaluation and assessment, and recently completed a postdoctoral residency in psychological evaluation. Her graduate training led Dr. Schutte to discover an interest in helping individuals with autism and developmental disorders. She has provided individual therapy, group therapy, and social skills training to individuals on the autism spectrum, and is excited to continue helping those with autism and related disorders by providing psychological evaluations at the Johnson Center. Before we begin the presentation, please note that questions can be typed into your control panel throughout the time, and, time permitting, they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Also, for those of you that have requested copies of the presentation, we cannot send out the slides. However, we do post recordings of all of our free webinars on the Johnson Center YouTube channel. Please search for us on YouTube and subscribe to get full access to all of our recorded webinars. Now please welcome Dr. Claire Schutte.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to talking with you over the next hour on social issues related to transitions for adolescents and adults with autism spectrum disorders. This is part 3 of a 4-part series that we've been presenting on transition issues. So I hope that you've been able to join me for part 1 and part 2 of the series. And as Nisi mentioned, on November 12th, I believe, I'll be presenting the 4th part, which is the last one, on post-secondary education and job-related issues for transitions. As Nisi mentioned, we are providing certificates of attendance for the webinar. This link here will take you to what you need for that, and I'll show that at the end of the presentation as well. So a quick overview of what I'm going to be covering today. I'm going to start off by talking about different areas of social issues that are related to transitions for adolescents and young adults with autism spectrum disorders. As we discussed during the independent living portion, that was the last webinar, part 2, we talked about how assessment can be very helpful in terms of intervention planning for a lot of assessment or a lot of transition related issues. So I'll be talking about assessment of social related skills and how that can help with transition planning. I'm then going to discuss some different teaching strategies that can be used to teach important social skills related to transitions. And then I'm going to be walking us through some important areas to plan for and consider that are particularly relevant for the transition to adulthood. And again, stay tuned for part 4 of this series on higher education and vocational issues. Since this is part of the series, I'd like to just provide a quick recap from the parts that we've covered so far for those of you who haven't been able to attend those webinars. And remember that those are also on our YouTube channel, as Nisi mentioned. But the first part of this series, we talked about just an overview of transition-related issues. So some important things to remember from part 1 are that there are certain laws and state-funded services that can help with transitions. And the main ones I've outlined here are the Individual Disabilities Education Act, with disabilities laws and state-funded services. I've provided a link to the Life Through Autism, and you can go to the link here. And at the end of this guide, there's a great appendix on different okay. Sorry for that pause. I think we're having some sound-related issues. Okay, sorry about that pause, everyone. We were just checking the audio equipment here, but hopefully you can all hear me. We'll try to troubleshoot if there are any other issues. So back to the recap for part one. Support is often provided for transitions by parents, teachers, therapists, and some of the different agencies that I mentioned. One important thing to remember regarding transitions is that the planning process should begin early, typically around the age of 14 or so. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act specifies that transition-related services be provided through public schools. So transition planning, if your child is in a public school, should be provided, and it should start early and be proactive before the transition actually starts. So a quick review from part two of the series, which was on independent living. We talked about how independent living skills are behaviors that help individuals live independently and function safely and appropriately in daily life. We talked about the importance of the assessment process for intervention planning and determining what independent living skills the individual needs support in, and using that information for a transition and intervention plan. We also reviewed some specific strategies for teaching independent living skills, such as chaining, shaping, reinforcement, self-monitoring techniques, social stories, modeling, visual cues, and schedules. And today, when we're talking about social skills, I'm also going to go over some specific strategies that can be used for teaching social skills. We also talked about some important areas to consider that are related to independent living and transition planning. So things such as personal care, daily living skills, safety-related skills, leisure, community participation, life skills, and what to consider with different residential arrangements. And again, feel free to view these webinars, part one and part two, on our YouTube channel if you'd like to get more details about these topics. So let's move into talking about social skills related to transitions and different social demands. Social needs and demands of individuals with autism spectrum disorders, they change throughout development and become much more pertinent in the teenage years. The teenage years bring a lot more social demands with them, and a lot of times issues such as fitting in can become more obvious and more challenging. Some of the new social demands that transition brings are things like related to independent living or living with roommates, transitioning to college and all of the new social demands that that brings, such as engaging with teachers, self-advocacy, and asking questions and getting needs met. Independent living skills have a lot of social demands that are related to them, as well as the transition to any type of employment also brings new social demands and needs. And the individual's social functioning is very important for success in many of these areas related to transitions, particularly the ones that I just discussed that are related to independent living, to work, to school. So some different areas of social importance during the transition period. General social skills are necessary. Again, these are going to change as the individual develops, but basic social skills such as small talk, conversation, nonverbal related social skills, these are all important during the transition process. Additionally, different types of relationships become important during the transition process, such as peer relationships and friendships, dating or romantic relationships, work relationships with employees, with customers, living relationships such as with roommates or with a residential assistant, for example, as well as school relationships, such as with teachers, with other students in the class, with a guidance counselor, or other support providers. As well as the area of community involvement and recreation is also important during the transition process. There can also be a lot of challenges regarding social functioning and skills during the transition. Social difficulties often become more pronounced in adolescence and young adulthood. Peers typically are more, they pick up on some of the social differences, so it can create issues of bullying or peer rejection, particularly during the teen years and adolescence. And some social challenges can also impact things like isolation, peer rejection, teacher rejection. It can lead to employment problems or difficulty obtaining employment, school problems, difficulty with independent living, and the social challenges can lead to symptoms of anxiety or depression as well. So as you can see, social functioning does have a very strong impact on a lot of different areas that are related to transitions for individuals with autism spectrum disorders. Now I'm going to move us into a discussion on assessment and intervention planning for social-related behaviors and skills. So during transition planning, which again should start early during adolescence, around the age of 14 or so. So early on in the transition process, it's important to assess the individual's social skills so that program planning can be developed to teach areas that are identified as areas of need before the individual transitions. So again, it's important to be proactive and to identify these areas of need so that the individual can gain necessary support and that these different skills that need to be supported or identified in their intervention plan. And that can help them and set them up for more success when the transition, say, to a job or to college actually occurs. So some ways that assessment can help is that it can help identify different areas of teaching and intervention need. It can help provide kind of a social profile of what the individual's social strengths are and what their social challenges are. Assessment can also help with treatment planning. So you're gathering this data from the assessment and using it to come up with a plan or an intervention plan to help the individual. An assessment also helps to continually measure progress and to measure how the skills are changing or improving. So during the planning process, that initial assessment of the individual's social skills can provide kind of a baseline of what skills they have and what they need support with. But it's important to remember how ongoing assessment can help. So you don't want to stop with just that first baseline assessment, but you want to continuously monitor and assess the individual social skills that you're working on so that you can identify what skills are improving and what skills aren't improving, so that you can kind of change the intervention plan to support this. So the assessment and the intervention plan, it's going to vary and be very individualized for the individual. So it's going to vary depending on things such as how verbal the individual is and their overall level of functioning. So when you're coming up with an intervention plan, it's important to remember that it's not a one-size-fits-all plan. You really want it to be tailored to the individual and what social skills they need most help with and what's pertinent to the transitions that they're going to be transitioning to. For example, is it going to be a job? Is it going to be school? Is it more just related to gaining more independent living skills while living at home with their parents? So everyone's plan is going to be somewhat different. I wanted to review some of the different assessment measures that can help with identifying social goals. The first one is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, or the ADOS. Many of you have probably heard about this assessment. It's one of the gold standard assessments that's often used for individuals with autism spectrum disorders. A lot of people view this assessment as helping early on with initial diagnoses, but it can also be very useful for adolescents and young adults, and can be used throughout adulthood and can help identify some different social related goals. Why I like it is that it's a standardized observational assessment. So you're not just gathering data through talking with a teacher or a parent, you're actually directly assessing the individual. So some areas that are assessed with the ADOS for adults would be things like nonverbal communication and eye contact, conversation-related skills, insight into social relationships. But the ADOS is a great observational tool to gather some of that data from. There's also a few helpful parent report questionnaires. Now these just go up to age 18, so they are somewhat limited for the adult range. And again, they do have to be filled out by a parent or sometimes a teacher. But the Social Skills Improvement System, or the SSIS, is a helpful one that can be filled out by a teacher or a parent to identify different social related skills that need support. Same thing with the Social Responsiveness Scale. It's a pretty brief questionnaire that parents can fill out based on their child's social related skills. Unfortunately, we're very limited in terms of what assessments have been developed specifically for adults with autism spectrum disorders. I really hope that more tools are made available. But one assessment that is available specifically for adults is the Adult Asperger Assessment, or the AAA. It has two components. It has an autism spectrum quotient as well as an empathy quotient, and it's filled out directly by the adult. And it can also be useful to identify different social related areas that the individual needs support with. I provided a reference to this assessment at the end because it can be obtained online. In addition to different questionnaires and direct assessments, you can also include things like a behavioral observation of the individual. This can really give you some helpful information, especially if you're doing it in more naturalistic settings, in social settings, such as at the individual school, or observing them on a social outing, or observing the individual on the job. Another great tool for gathering information on the individual's social skills is just to simply interview parents, teachers, maybe a boss, individuals that work with the teen or young adult, to identify and hear what they've noticed in terms of their social skills and what they could use more support with. It's best not to rely just on one of these sources of data when you're doing an assessment of social functioning. So you want to combine multiple sources of assessment to get a well-rounded picture of what the individual's strengths and weaknesses are. So one of these puzzle pieces might be the ADOS, another might be talking with the individual's teacher or therapist. Another might be a parent report questionnaire, and you're kind of putting all of the pieces together to get an accurate idea of what needs to be included in the intervention plan. So once you've gathered your data on the individual's social skills, you're ready to create an intervention plan that, again, is based on the assessment results. You also want to consider the unique needs of the adolescent or adult that you're working with and consider their overall transition plan. Again, not every young adult with autism is going to be facing the same adult transitions as others, so you want to make sure that it's individualized and that you're considering their unique needs. So you're taking all of this to create kind of a blueprint for how you're going to teach the necessary social skills and what support they need. So in the social intervention plan, you want to include who's going to teach the skills and how they're going to do so. So depending on the individual, you might have one person that's working on social skills, or you might have more of a team approach of different people that will be working on the social skills. So it might be a therapist, such as a behavior analyst. It might be more of a mentor or a social mentor. A teacher might be working on the social skills, or the individual might be attending more of a social group or a group learning type setting. Or it might be a combination of these, but you want to identify that in the intervention plan. You also want to include how those goals are going to be taught. So first off, you want to make sure that the social goals are clearly defined and clearly stated so that everyone who's working with the individual understands what specifically is to be targeted. You want to include the type of therapy or technique that you're going to be using to teach the different skills, such as using ABA or applied behavior analysis techniques. You also want to identify if you're including specific curriculum, such as Michelle Garcia Winner's social thinking curriculum, or the UCLA Peers Program curriculum, for example. You want to identify if it's going to be in a group or individual setting, and also the specific settings or contexts that the skills are going to be taught, such as a classroom versus social outings. Okay. Now I'd like to talk about some specific strategies that can be used to teach the skills that you've identified. Some of these are similar to the strategies that we talked about with teaching independent living skills, and some of them are a little different. So direct instruction is commonly used, and basically what direct instruction is you're teaching a skill using lectures or demonstrations, kind of more like classroom-based learning or teaching a lesson. A lot of times direct instruction might be used in combination with some of these other methods. Modeling is another great strategy for teaching social skills. So this can be done in person, so directly in front of the young adult. You can model different social skills, and this can be done with one model or using multiple models, and kind of displaying and demonstrating what a particular social skill should look like. Videos can also be used to model different social skills. So these could be videos from a specific social curriculum, or you can even use videos or movies to show in real life what different social skills might look like. Self-monitoring can also be useful, so you might set up a particular social checklist for the individual so that they can kind of self-monitor how many times I made eye contact with my employees today, and you might set up kind of a simple checklist for them. Or you might use charts that have different social related skills that the individual kind of self-monitors throughout the week, and they might put an X or a check mark or something like that to indicate that they've met those social goals. Role play is also a great strategy for teaching social skills. So you might have two therapists, for example, kind of act out a scenario. Let's say you're teaching conflict resolution for roommates. So you might have two therapists act out a scenario of working through a conflict, and then you might involve the young adult and have them role play with you to practice how they might approach a conflict resolution issue with their roommate. So role play is a great way to kind of practice. Social stories and social scripts can also be useful. They can provide a great visual of different social related skills. Sometimes these kind of look like a comic where they might depict different social related scenarios, what different people might say, so that the individual can have a visual and an example of how to kind of perform different social skills or deal with different social related scenarios. It's important to remember to use just basic reinforcement when teaching social skills. So making sure when you're working with the individual to reinforce appropriate social behavior and when they are meeting their social goals. Prompting is another basic strategy that can be used. For example, just providing prompts for eye contact. You know, that's a pretty simple strategy, but it can be useful, and you can get creative in terms of how you provide the prompts. Visual aids also can be very useful. So things like providing pictures of different facial expressions that might indicate that a person might be interested in engaging with you, and facial expressions that might show that the person isn't interested in engaging or you probably shouldn't approach. So visual aids can also be helpful. And there's a lot of great social skills curriculum out there, again, such as the social thinking curriculum or the UCLA Peers program is another great curriculum that can be used. So just as with assessment, you don't want to rely on just one source of teaching. You want to use a combination of different teaching methods based on the individual's needs. For example, you might use a combination of direct instruction in more of a classroom-based setting, but then use some role play and some visual aids to kind of help master the skill. It's also important to remember generalization of these skills, um, and to make sure you're programming for that as well. Um, it's pretty common that these skills might be taught in a class type setting, but you want to make sure that you're looking to see, are these skills generalizing to more social settings, and making sure that you're teaching the skills in those relevant settings if they're not generalizing. So I thought I would share some different examples of real world social skills training. Early on in my training, I worked as a social mentor with young adults with autism spectrum disorders. It was a post-secondary residential program, and I was responsible for teaching the social skills, but it was also neat because we did a lot of community outings, and could really had a lot of flexibility in practicing social skills in more real world settings, such as on a college campus or at a store, for example. So one example of teaching social skills that I had used was using video modeling in practice. So a lot of times I would start with, for example, teaching conversation-related skills in more of a direct instruction type setting. So we would go through a lesson on starting conversation, how to keep it going, how to wrap up the conversation, and talk about different examples of doing so. Then what we would do is practice using a video camera. So I would practice with the young adult, and they would start up conversation, and we would go through the conversation together. And then we would watch the video together. And what I made sure to do was, both of us would kind of critique ourselves. And so I would go through and mention what I noticed about the conversation, areas that I felt that I could have worked on better, and areas that I thought went well. And then the young adult would do the same. And then I would provide some feedback on what I noticed in terms of their conversation skills in the video. But I found that using the video camera, it really was a great teaching tool because it can provide a visual of how the skill is taking place and gives you a lot more information because we don't always remember or see how we appear to others. Another example of teaching social skills was teaching small talk. So what I did was we came up with different small talk flashcards that had common ways that you can start up small talk, such as topics like the weather or holiday plans or weekend plans. And with the young adult, I went through these different small talk flashcards until they demonstrated that they remembered most of the topics that could be used to start up small talk. So that was kind of, again, more of a direct instruction type lesson on small talk. But then we worked on generalizing the small talk skill to more real life settings. So what we did was during a barbecue with peers, this young adult's goal was to start up small talk with 3 different people using the different topics that we had learned with the flashcards. And I also integrated using prompts in this scenario. And what we did, this was kind of before texting was big, but I used the cell phone to call the young adult when he needed a prompt to start up small talk. And he had his phone on vibrate, so when he felt the vibration, it was a prompt to start up small talk. So that was an example of using direct instruction as well as programming for generalization and using different prompts to teach the social skill of small talk or starting up small talk. And then a final example of kind of putting some of these different strategies together is I did some direct instruction on teaching what nonverbal behaviors make other people seem approachable. So we talked about things like how to notice or what cues there are when someone's busy and you probably shouldn't approach them. What body language do they show that makes them look approachable? So we did this in more of a classroom-based setting again. But then we went to a college campus and just sat and observed college students. And the young adults' goal was to identify to me what students they were observing looked approachable and what specific nonverbal behaviors were they showing that made them look approachable. So I hope those examples give you an idea of how you can kind of piece together some of these different strategies for teaching social skills, and also how you can program for generalization to make sure that they're occurring in more real-life environments. These are just some examples of different areas of social skills an individual might need support with. I'm not going to go over all of these in detail. And again, the assessment process will help you piece out, for example, some of these different social behaviors that the individual might need to work on. So for one individual, it might be things like conversation, listening skills, and understanding social rules and norms. So again, you want to look into a wide variety of different social related behaviors and pull out which ones are most important to the individual. The hidden curriculum is a term that's based on the research of Brenda Smith-Miles, and the hidden curriculum is very pertinent, especially in the adolescent and teen years and during transition-related years. And basically what the hidden curriculum is it's social information that most of us kind of learn along the way, but isn't directly taught. So in some ways it can be thought of common sense related to social situations. The hidden curriculum is kind of unstated or unwritten social norms and rules. And the hidden curriculum can be very difficult for teens and adults with autism to understand because of the kind of unwritten and unclear nature of it. And the hidden curriculum can change according to the individual's age, their gender, their environment, and context. So some examples of hidden curriculum type situations would be at work there's a plate of brownies and it says help yourself. There's a hidden curriculum that you shouldn't just help yourself to every single brownie on the plate. You should take one and save some for the rest of your coworkers. However, again, this is kind of an unwritten rule, and an individual on the spectrum might not quite understand why help yourself doesn't mean, help yourself to all of them. So that might be a scenario that needs to be taught more explicitly. Another example of hidden curriculum material might be the act of asking how old someone is. A lot of times this is okay to ask, a younger peer or someone your age. But there is a hidden curriculum or an unwritten rule that it's often thought of as rude if you ask an adult how old they are. So it's important when you're working with adolescents and young adults with autism to identify what hidden curriculum issues might be pertinent to them, and also to talk them through and work on them as they occur and come up in the individual's day-to-day life. Because there's so much hidden curriculum out there, it's impossible to just teach it all. So it can be helpful to kind of work on it as it comes, as well as try to identify what hidden curriculum type scenarios might be pertinent to the individual. So lastly, I'm going to talk about some different areas that are important to consider related to social issues and relationships during the transition period. There's a lot of peer issues that are pertinent during the transition time. So things like friendships, understanding what a friendship is, different types of friendships, the steps in finding and maintaining friendships, everything about small talk and conversation is very important, such as initiating, sustaining, and ending conversation, conversational turn taking, what topics are appropriate. And really, this skill is important for many different relationships, such as peer relationships, work relationships, school relationships. So that social communication, again, is an important piece. Another peer-related issue is how to find things in common with peers. Nonverbal social behaviors related to peers, things such as personal space, eye contact, appearing interested or not interested, reciprocal social skills, issues related to group settings, so things like entering into a group of peers, talking in a group, or group conversations. So all of these are just examples related to peers. And it even goes into things like making social plans, so how to make a social plan with a peer. And dealing with any bullying can also be important in the peer area. Romantic related relationships and social relationships, or just romantic interest in peers, becomes very important during the adolescent and young adult periods and during transitions. So some things to consider in this area are reviewing what social cues show when someone's interested, or how to show your interest in someone else using nonverbal behaviors, for example. Approaching and initiating interactions is important. So again, I talked about how social communication is important really across the board in terms of transition-related areas. So it is important as well when we're talking about more romantic relationships and interest. You also want to cover sustaining interactions. So once the young adult approaches someone, how to sustain that and keep it going, as well as focusing on how to wrap it up and cues to look for from the other person that they might be interested in that kind of signal that it's time to wrap up the interaction. Dating also becomes important. So within this area, going over things like what is a boyfriend or a girlfriend, what is dating, and kind of the how-tos and the hidden curriculum regarding dating. And it's also very important to review what healthy relationships are. So including sexual health and safety. We did do a presentation on just sexuality in general that would give some helpful information on this topic. You can find that presentation on our YouTube channel. But this is a very important area to cover during the transition process. Self-advocacy within relationships is also very important. So helping the young adult express their needs and feel comfortable in doing so. And also just reviewing what a healthy relationship involves. Work is another very important area. So some basic things are important in the employment area, such as remembering coworkers' names, greetings and departures in the workplace. And again, these are all just examples of some different areas that are important in the areas of work or peer relationships or romantic relationships. It's not an all-inclusive list that I've included here. So I just want to emphasize that in these different areas, you're going to be creating an individualized program within these general areas based on what the individual's needs are. So I've used these different examples just to provide examples of what might be important. Self-advocacy in the workplace is important. So again, expressing needs, asking questions, nonverbal behaviors in the workplace, social boundaries in the workplace, understanding different social cues and hidden curriculum in the workplace, such as when and how to approach others, identifying what nonverbals might show that a person is busy and that you shouldn't approach them, for example. It's also important to cover how to make good impressions. I'll be covering some more specific related employment issues in part 4 of this series, which will be covering education and jobs. So I'll be talking about interview-related issues, but it's important to talk about how to make good impressions in the workplace, as well as appropriate versus inappropriate behavior, such as using humor. What types of humor or jokes might be okay at work, and which ones won't be appropriate. And you also want to make sure to cover different behaviors that are okay with coworkers versus with customers, and how to make that differentiation. Some other examples might be social behavior during breaks at work, during work social events, during mealtime at work, and kind of overall etiquette and manners related to the workplace. Let's see. Living is the next general area. So there's also a lot of social related behaviors that are important with living and different living type transitions that might occur. So in terms of roommate relationships, you might want to cover some issues such as getting along with roommates, sharing responsibility, conflict resolution, perspective taking, kind of understanding where the roommate might have been coming from with a particular conflict, communicating with neighbors, neighbor or roommate etiquette and kind of manners, communicating with landlords, group home managers, residential assistants. There's a lot of different social related behaviors that might be pertinent in regards to different living and independent living type settings. Let's see, in terms of school and post-secondary education, some examples of areas of importance might be classroom social behavior, so things such as what to wear to class, body language and nonverbal behavior in class, chatting and getting to know other students, communicating and interacting with teachers, different behaviors related to classroom etiquette, such as how often it's okay to raise your hand in the class, the importance of showing up on time, things like voice volume when you are asking a question in the class, as well as self-advocacy is important within higher education. So helping the individual feel comfortable asking a guidance counselor a question or going up to their teacher at the end of class when they didn't quite understand something. And the last area that I'd like to touch on is just community involvement and leisure or recreation. Community involvement can provide a lot of social opportunities for teens and young adults with autism spectrum disorders as they go through the transition process. And it can provide opportunities for them building social relationships as well. So you want to focus on things such as how to join community activities, help them find different community activities that might be appropriate, reviewing the steps of and helping them successfully integrate into groups, supporting them and getting to know others. And community involvement can also be very helpful in finding common interests with others. So there might be a particular group on that's related to a special interest the individual might have, and this might be a great resource for them for building connections with others. So again, as you're creating more of a social intervention plan, you want to consider all of these important areas, including peer relationships, work, school, any independent living type areas of importance, and kind of piece together a plan that works with the individual and their unique needs. So that takes us to the end of my presentation, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time before we get to questions just on reviewing some helpful resources and references. A lot of these resources you've probably seen if you've tuned into part 1 and part 2 of the series. I've included a lot of article channel. I'm not going to go through one in detail, so I'll just hold the screen up here for a moment and go through each slide. But again, remember that you can review this presentation on our YouTube channel if you aren't able to write down all of the resources that I have listed here. So here's some helpful websites. Here's some more. There's some great transition toolkits out there. Autism Speaks has one that there's a link to. Services page. These are just really like classroom. There's some great transitional guides out there. The second one here is the one that I provided the link to earlier that has the great appendices that has a chart there that outlines the different laws that are related to transition type issues, but there's chapters on almost every important area of transitions for young adults with autism. This one up here is also really helpful. The Transition to Adulthood Guidelines for Individuals with Autism Spectrum Disorders by the Ohio Autism Task Force. Rightslaw.org. Rightslaw is a wonderful website that has a lot of great information on education-related laws and understanding what those are. Here's some specific resources for social skills. Talking more about this curriculum, which is a great social curriculum based out of UCLA. There's some resources instruction-based setting. And then here are some references that I've used for this presentation.
Web events.
Okay, I have a question here that asks, what type of social assessment do you use? In terms of social assessments that I use, it'll depend on what the individual's assessment needs are. Um, Most often, I do use the ADOS assessment, or the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, I really like this assessment because it's standardized and it's directly administered. There aren't that many other assessments out there that are directly administered to assess social skills. So the ADOS I like using to have that observational measure with the teen or young adult. And again, it can give you a sense of, things like conversation skills, nonverbal behavior, insight into social relationships, insight into things like emotions and empathy. So it can really be a great observational tool for assessing social skills. And then usually I'll include some other measures such as the social skills improvement system or the social responsiveness scale, kind of based on what the goals are. But usually a combination of those, as well as talking to a parent if that's available, are what I'll use for a social assessment. But again, I'd like to stress the importance of getting multiple sources of data when you are doing an assessment. So not just relying on one assessment, but maybe doing a combination, as well as a combination with maybe a behavioral observation or an interview with a parent or a teacher. Let's see, I'm just going to read through some more of the questions. Okay, this other one is a great question. It says, we have a new middle school student and many of his classmates have iPhones and Facebook pages. With his challenges, is it a good idea to allow our son to engage in these formats? That is a great question, and it's going to kind of vary from student to student and family to family. There can be a lot of risks with technology and Facebook. So I think the best answer is to come up with something that works for your family. But it can also be important to kind of monitor the adolescent or young adult's behavior with social media such as Facebook or iPhones, because there are some of those risks for things like bullying on Facebook or inappropriate content that they might be more prone to compared to other children. So if they are going to participate in those, making sure to try to monitor it as much as you can and have open communication with your child about what some of those risks are, and kind of checking in with them to see how it's going. But again, it's going to kind of vary according to the adolescent or young adult and how ready they are for that, as well as how the individual family feels in terms of allowing that. But there is that kind of fine line, because you don't want your child to be left out of some of those social media type activities that a lot of the kids are very into. But I think it's important, again, to stress having open communication with them and a level of monitoring to make sure that they're not, facing any bullies on Facebook, for example, or they understand what's appropriate or inappropriate to look at or post or things like that. I hope that answers your question. It can be kind of individualized depending on the family, so I don't have a one clear-cut answer for you for that one, but it is a very pertinent issue for many families in terms of Facebook and iPhones and texting and all of that. Okay, let's see. I think I have time for one more quick question. This one says, is there any info for what parents can do in the home environment to increase social interactions? There's a lot of books out there that can be used. I referenced some of them, my research books on helpful different curriculums that can be helpful. All of the teaching strategies that I reviewed could be used by a parent. So if you're going over a certain social skill with your child, you can use role play or use social stories from a book, or really all of those parents can help support their child in terms of teaching some of those social skills. So yes, most of what I talked about today can be implemented by parents, and there are a lot of helpful books out there as well that can provide you with some more guidance of how to go about doing that. And it looks like we're out of time for questions. I'm glad that I was able to get to a few of those. I hope you enjoyed the presentation today. Thank you for joining me, and please stay tuned for part 4, where we'll be talking about jobs and higher education and issues related to that. There's a quick link to where you need to go if you need a certificate of attendance. And this last if you want to look other parts of the YouTube channel, here's a Facebook that we did with some different educational material. And again, thank you for joining me.